2024 marks 80 years since the founding of the Liberal Party of Australia. The party is an enduring legacy of Robert Menzies and others. Today's episode of Afternoon Light forms part of a special 10-part series to commemorate this 80th anniversary. Each of the 10 episodes will feature an author from our upcoming book on the founding of the Liberal Party, Unity in Autonomy. The book will be available from Connor Court and the Robert Menzies Institute's website in October this year. When first Australia's statesmen rose, they took the task in hand to gain the boon of liberty in this our fatherland. Of Henry Parkes and Dunmore Lang and Wentworth's bold we brag, they raised the flag we fly today, the good old Liberal flag. Now that was Banjo Patterson's campaign song for the 1907 New South Wales election. So the Liberal flag was flying way back then, and today we're going to discuss the history of the founding of the Liberal Party in New South Wales with the Robert Menzies Institute's own historian, Dr. Zachary Gorman, who is himself a New South Welshman.
Vehemently so.
Vehemently so, yes, but a long time now resident of the state of Victoria, but maybe you'll go back one day. Zach, New South Wales has always had a sort of sense of exceptionalism in terms of white settlement of Australia. Of course, it's the first colony. Sydney's been the sort of first city and the biggest city. I think Melbourne's about to take over that mantle. But there is a sort of pride and parochialism in New South Wales that, I mean, you probably do get it in other states, but going to Sydney, you do get the sense that they know they're best. They think they're best. Tell me about this unique way that New South Wales sees itself, and I guess particularly in a political sense too.
Yeah, well, that song by Banjo Patterson really speaks to that, I think, because it quite literally is taking the position that New South Wales' history is Australia's history, which is true in a lot of sense. I mean, Queensland and Victoria are just secessionists who left New South Wales, and the other states aren't important enough for us to worry about as much. But there's certain aspects to that parochialism, because it's a parochialism that's quite different from the other states, because so many of the other states have this idea of themselves defining themselves against Canberra and against Sydney and Melbourne and against the more populous states. Whereas our parochialism is so deeply ingrained that it almost doesn't exist, in the sense that we are the only state without a dedicated New South Wales history journal. Because why would you have a journal dedicated to New South Wales history when New South Wales history is just Australia's history? I mean, I even got in a little thing with Jeffrey Blaney about whether William Wentworth is truly a national figure, because when William Wentworth was doing all these great accomplishments, New South Wales was Australia. And I think that the New South Wales Liberals do well when they tap into that sense of history and they tap into that sort of arrogance. I mean, in 2011, their electoral slogan was "Make New South Wales number one again," which is very MAGA-esque.
Yes.
In hindsight.
You write in your chapter in Unity in Autonomy that Joseph Carruthers, and you've written a biography of him, describes Federation as New South Wales gathering up her wandering brood. So that sense that Federation was a New South Wales project, that it was an effort on the part of New South Wales to sort of assert a federal nation, a federated nation together, but sort of under its own mantle as the mother colony.
Yes, to reclaim that position of a sort of unified Australia that had existed before these secessions. Though there's an extent to which Carruthers, he says that during the debates with the federal conventions, and it obviously goes down a bit like a lead balloon. And there's some argument I've made in the biography that Carruthers may have been deliberately antagonising the other delegates just to make Reid look better in contrast.
So in terms of the development of centre-right politics in New South Wales, it's quite distinct from, say, Victoria, where, you know, Alfred Deakin is a major leader in the development of Australian liberalism. What is it about New South Wales that makes centre-right politics so distinct there?
Well, I would say that New South Wales really presages what happens at a federal level. And for that reason, it's sort of ahead of the curve with a lot of these developments as far as the emergence of a centre-right Australian Liberal Party. It doesn't have the same level of confusion that you have in all the various other states. So from 1891, the Labor Party emerges in New South Wales. The previous election in 1897, you had the emergence of the first sort of clear party system with the split between free traders and protectionists. So in the 1890s, we have what's essentially the 311s, these three parties vying for political power and leaving Labor in a sort of position of kingmaker where it's able to exercise legislative influence beyond its power in the parliament, which is exactly what the first decade of federal politics is going to be. So it's Carruthers, who's a sort of deputy under first Parkes and then George Reid, who really sees from an early date, from certainly 1902 when he's founding the Liberal and Reform Association, that the future of Australian politics is going to be a divide between liberalism and socialism, or liberalism and Labor. And for that reason, he has this understanding that Australian liberalism is going to be a centre-right understanding of liberalism. He still very much has this Whig tradition of progress, and once he becomes Premier from 1904, he continues very major reforms, including introducing comprehensive local government in New South Wales. But at the same time, as the son of a convict who had sort of had this story of himself as a self-made man, he realises that New South Wales is a land of tremendous opportunity and social mobility, and you actually have to preserve those elements of the system that are working, that are so successful. You shouldn't be constantly trying to make a utopia when things are already pretty great in Australia.
Is it at that point, do you think, that Australian liberalism takes a very different path, say, from American liberalism, which obviously ends up being quite a left-leaning social democratic project?
Yes, I definitely would say. There's actually an article I wrote many years ago for a website that was actually called Menzies House. It was originally a Quadrant article, but it didn't get up. But anyway, it was...
No hard feelings, Zach.
It was talking about how the 1890s was a moment in time where there was tremendous crossover between the strands of liberalism across the Anglosphere. Because not only did you have Reid in New South Wales, but you had William Gladstone in Britain, who had a very sort of small government, retrenchment and reform understanding of what liberalism meant. And then in the United States, you had Grover Cleveland, the rarest of rare entities back then, a Northern Democrat, who's the only president who wanted to reduce the size of government. So this is a time in which liberals across the Anglosphere did believe similar things, but then they all went down very different paths. And I've argued that what Carruthers does in New South Wales, so what Carruthers does that's really important, is he not only founds this prototypical centre-right organisation that has the branch structures, the pre-selections, all the things you might associate with a modern Liberal Party, but then he wins the 1904 election in such a decisive fashion that the protectionists, who have renamed themselves the Progressives, are just defeated as a political force. And you pretty much immediately have that really clear divide between Liberal and Labor. And I've argued that George Reid's famous anti-socialist campaigns of 1905 to 1906 are an attempt to emulate this same thing at a federal level, and that the developments that ultimately lead to the Fusion Liberal Party are an attempt to achieve what Carruthers has achieved, even though it can't be as perfect at the federal level.
The protectionists in New South Wales obviously face a terrible election in 1904. Do you ever see them again in New South Wales, or they're just sort of extinct really as a political entity?
They're a weird group, the protectionists in New South Wales, because they sort of have two wings. They have a radical wing most associated with the man who was for a time the Secretary of Public Works, Edward O'Sullivan, and the newspaper used to write it O'Sullivan, OWE, because he spent so much money that it plunged the whole state into debt.
Very droll.
And he was this like big role for the state, had a lot of connections to Labor, could easily have been a Labor figure. But then the rest of the Protectionist Party was actually rural seats, often border seats that had to compete with the tariffs that the other colonies had been imposing, and they therefore wanted New South Wales to introduce tariffs in a retaliatory sense. So that aspect of the protectionists is actually a proto-country party. And even when the country party does re-emerge in New South Wales at the end of the First World War, it is initially called the Progressive Party rather than the Country Party.
Did Joseph Carruthers, who you sort of, I guess, style as a founder of the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party in some respects, does he have a clear political philosophy? Do you identify that early strands in that early 20th century?
Yeah, it's a promotion of the individual, of local autonomy, so that real emphasis on having local government and making political decisions at the most local level that is practicable. He abolishes state income tax and most forms of stamp duty and really tries to keep the budget in line. But above all, it's what I would say that Carruthers has that gets recaptured in the 1940s, but sort of goes extinct in between, is this real profound sense of human agency, this positive understanding of liberalism, that if you actually give people the freedom to flourish, they will make Australia a better place. They will strive and they will achieve. And I think the Great War and the Great Depression took a lot of that positive veneer out of Australian liberalism, and that's one of the reasons it struggled during those decades.
Did you find he articulated these beliefs in speeches or books, writing articles?
Yeah, so he didn't have the same attempt to write a political philosophy that you get by the time you get to the 1940s. This is a real wartime concept that you need a comprehensive liberal philosophy. His philosophy comes out through his speeches, both his campaign speeches and his Hansard speeches. He's got a wonderfully sweet Hansard speech where he's defending the right of Indigenous New South Welshmen to have the vote. He's grown up for a time with Indigenous people in the northern rivers of New South Wales, where he went when he was a sickly child. And yet he even knew some Indigenous language and these sorts of things. So he's a profound liberal in that sense as well. But his real strength is actually organisational. He had actually been running the campaigns for Parkes and Reid basically since the late 1880s. So he's bringing all this experience to founding the Liberal and Reform Association and combining the two roles, being the parliamentary leader and the organisational leader, whereas previously those two strands had often been in conflict.
The interesting thing about New South Wales politics is the dominance of the Labor Party, despite Joseph Carruthers' best efforts. Why does his Liberal dominance fade in this period?
Well, Carruthers was the member for St George, and his Liberal Party, and to some extent Reid's Liberal Party, had really dominated the outer suburbs of Sydney, had really had a lockdown on the aspirational voters, even down into areas like Kiama, which is where Carruthers initially grew up. But its successes really get sort of narrowed down into being exclusively represented in North Sydney and East Sydney. So this sort of silvertail reputation. People who support the Sea Eagles or the Roosters are not going to be...
You're losing me here, Zach.
...particularly electorally popular. But then Labor has the opposite. The real secret to the success of the New South Wales Labor Party is twofold. One is a real success in winning country voters. You look at the electoral maps of New South Wales for much of the 20th century, and you're shocked at all the red out in rural New South Wales. The country party is not holding up its end of the bargain. But more than that, you have the industrial districts of the Illawarra and Newcastle, which at a time when rural seats are weighted so you get more representation for rural areas, really push up the Labor vote. And then the other thing that the New South Wales Labor Party always has is it has a real predominance of conservative Catholics. And the conservative Catholics, while they might be a small percentage of the voting public, maybe 30% or whatever, having them active within the organisation means that it never becomes a radical Labor Party. It's known, much like the Tasmanian Labor Party, for its inherent conservatism. The exception to that is Bert Everett. But ironically, by the late 1950s, you have the New South Wales Labor Party pitching itself to Conservative voters that you need to re-elect Joe Cahill so there will be a Conservative counterbalance to Evatt within the Labor Party. It's just bizarre.
Yeah. But the Lang saga, though, would have been a bit of a major issue for the Labor Party in New South Wales. How did they overcome that?
Well, the Lang saga is a lesson to the New South Wales Labor Party. So Jack Lang, we've had a Afternoon Light episode with David Clune on Jack Lang. He's this really destructive sort of Labor Trump figure. And yeah, he destroys the New South Wales Labor Party, but it inoculates them against all those sort of splitting diseases that later emerge in the 1950s. And the person who replaces Lang as leader of the Labor Party, William McKell, deliberately styles himself as the anti-Lang, that everything that Lang was, I'm going to do the opposite, which again is really leaning into that idea of a steady hand at the wheel. We're not going to have too radical of proposals. We're even going to accept amendments from the Legislative Council, things like that.
And McKell goes on to be an incredibly successful Premier of New South Wales, doesn't he?
Well, he lays the foundation. So he's Premier from 41 till 47. The 41 election is just a ridiculous bloodbath. In a House of 90 seats at the 41 election, the coalition loses 33 seats. It's just unfathomable. They lose more than half their seats. It's sort of like the Campbell-Newman bloodbath in Queensland. And yeah, he's Premier for 6 years, but Labor just keeps on being in government all the way till 1964 because of that solid platform that he helps to lay.
What about the problems for the centre-right too in New South Wales of fostering new talent? I mean, there's the incident where an independent candidate, Percy Spender, and of course his granddaughter becomes an independent candidate, rolls Archdale Parkhill, who had been a significant UAP figure. And you have these centre-right leaning independents, but they're not actually joining the political parties of the centre-right.
Yeah, so liberalism, as I've long argued, is a pre-party phenomenon in Australia, that in a time before established political parties, everyone called themselves liberals, and the liberal tradition therefore develops this very independent streak, which still you can see in upholding of freedom of conscience and having a platform that doesn't actually bind the parliamentary party, these sorts of things. So that independent streak is very much alive and well in New South Wales in the 30s. And to have Percy Spender roll Parkhill, he's rolling the sitting Minister for Defence. He's rolling the person who came within a couple of votes of actually beating Menzies to be deputy leader of the UAP. So you've got that blue ribbon seat completely wasted. You have Billy Hughes into his 80s holding on to a seat that, again, even though he started out with Labor, by the time he's the 40s, he's just taking up the safest billet he can get.
And he goes all over the country, doesn't he? Well, he at least goes between Victoria and New South Wales, finding electorates to represent. He doesn't seem to have an attachment to any community at all.
Yeah, and Richard Casey got a bit upset that he wasn't allowed to parachute into wherever he wanted for the 1946 federal election. He sort of wanted similar treatment, but he wasn't a Hughes. But Hughes, at least, his origins were in New South Wales. He'd been a member of the New South Wales Parliament in the 1890s. But by the time you get to the Unity Conference in Canberra in 1944, there are just 4 federal UAP parliamentarians from all of New South Wales. There's no senators whatsoever. There's 4 lower house members. One of them is Spender and another is Hughes, both of whom are suspended from the parliamentary UAP. So they're in a sort of more redeeming situation. So you're left with 2, one of whom plans on retiring at 1946 election, so is not even going to face the electors as a Liberal. So you're just left with Eric Harrison, who pretty much carries the New South Wales federal UAP, then Liberal Party, on his entire back. And until Peter Costello actually held the record for the longest serving deputy leader of the Liberal Party.
So tell me about the groups from New South Wales who were represented at the Unity Conference. We've obviously got Eric Harrison, and he'd been a member of Menzies' National Service Group. So, been, I guess, a fellow traveller with Robert Menzies for some time. But who else was there? There were other groups as well, weren't there?
So, yeah, it's 3 groups that attend the Unity Conference from New South Wales outside of the parliamentarians. One is the New South Wales Institute of Public Affairs, which is founded pretty much exactly the same time as the Victorian Institute of Public Affairs, but is quite different in the sense that it wants to take a far more active role in politics, whereas the Victorian APA, even from an early date, is happy just to be a think tank, just to develop policy ideas and make arguments in the newspapers and these sorts of things. The New South Wales IPA wants to actually be a part of the Liberal Party. And there's all sorts of tensions around that because there have been these big donor bodies. The one in New South Wales was called the Consultative Council, that have these money power influences over the UAP that is very controversial. And then the 2 political parties that come to the Unity Conference from New South Wales is the Democratic Party, which is the old UAP that's rebranded itself as the Democratic Party after failed unity talks with the third organisation, which is the Liberal Democratic Party under Ernest White.
It's interesting that there was not a women's representation, though, particularly from New South Wales. You obviously from Victoria and Tasmania see those groups represented very fulsomely.
Yeah, so Carruthers had been good on this point, that he had a Women's Liberal League that was an existing organisation that was separate from the LRA, ultimately got amalgamated with the LRA and was guaranteed positions on its board, very similar to the early sort of Liberal Party arrangements.
We should say the LRA for those
Liberal
not...
and Reform, for those tuning in halfway through the episode.
Yes, yeah. Indeed.
So New South Wales Liberals had not had a grey record on that front, but by the 1940s, there just isn't the interest in giving women's representation the prominence it gains in other states. One of the main problems is the Australian Women's National League. It doesn't exist in New South Wales. The main centre-right women's organisation doesn't exist in New South Wales. And that, you could argue, is a significant factor in the electoral setbacks that are experienced in New South Wales in the early 1940s, because that's such a campaigning reservoir that the Victorian centre-right have that the New South Wales centre-right simply doesn't.
Do you know why it didn't develop, the AWNL didn't develop in New South Wales? Were there reasons why it worked in Victoria but didn't in New South Wales? It worked in Tasmania too. So was it to do with the protagonists involved, or was it the New South Wales centre-right male politicians were just sort of pushing women aside?
Yes, I think it's that sort of narrow clique. So you have Millicent Preston Stanley, who's elected in 1925 as the first female member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. And she is of the centre-right. She is a nationalist candidate and ultimately heads the Australian women's movement against socialisation in the 1940s, which shows that there's still plenty of talented women working in New South Wales Liberal politics in the 1940s. But yeah, they just don't get the opportunities that they deserve. And that lasts for decades and decades as far as Liberals, both federal and state, being unable to promote women in New South Wales.
Yes, I think it's not until Eileen Furley is elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council on a casual vacancy in 1962 that they get a female. So it's quite a wait, isn't it?
Yeah, almost a 40-year gap from Millicent Preston Stanley. And Eileen Furley is an early party organiser. She's on the provisional executive and then the first New South Wales state executive. And she's very clear that any political party in the 40s, if it wants to succeed, needs to have women candidates and women on the platform. This is the same era that you have the Women for Canberra movement in 1943 and the first 2 female members of federal parliament elected. So that is the sort of zeitgeist in the way that tide is moving. But the tide doesn't move with the New South Wales Liberals.
So you talked about the three political entities who are represented from New South Wales at the Unity conferences. The LDP is led by Ernest White. Can you tell me more about Ernest White and why he becomes such an important figure in the early Liberal Party?
Well, he's a very eccentric figure. He's a decorated World War I captain that's sort of mentioned in dispatches, and I think he owns a military cross or something like that. And his family background's in the timber industry around Gosford, and that's where his sort of family wealth come in. But what he gets really obsessed with is America. He founds in the 1930s, I think it's 1936, the British American Cooperation Movement, which changes its name several times, becomes more about Australia and America rather than mentioning Britain. And yeah, he's very enamored of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He actually resurrects the New South Wales free trade tradition. The LDP on its platform is all for free trade, but that's less to do with resurrecting the tradition of Reid. I don't think Ernest White had much of a sense of Australian history. It's more to actually live up to the Atlantic Charter. And even the monument, the Australian-American monument in Canberra, that big pole with the eagle on top of it that gets erected in 1954, he's ultimately responsible for that.
Oh, right. So he's deeply committed to the relationship with America then. But he has, doesn't he, quite a sort of religious element to his political philosophy and the development of his political party too, doesn't he?
Yeah, so he goes to great efforts to develop a full philosophy for his Liberal Democratic Party. That's what he really feels is lacking in the UAP, that the UAP has become completely hollow because it has no guiding principles to steer it. It's basically just the nationalist vampire that had sucked the blood of the All for Australia leagues and managed to keep itself alive for another decade, but that source of fresh blood is finally drying up. But he's sort of too messianic. You read so I went to actually the National Library and have looked through Ernest White's papers in preparing for this chapter, and there is a booklet there called The Philosophy of the Liberal Democratic Party. But it begins with faith in God. It's very explicitly Christian. Almost all liberal philosophies written in the 1940s will draw on Christian tenets. But this is the one that makes it very clear that, no, you basically have to be a Christian to be a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. And he sees liberal democracy as a political system that can put into practice the precept of love thy neighbor. That love thy neighbor is ultimately what individual human beings are going to be judged on at the end of their days. And it's actually very difficult to implement in real life because, there's all sorts of tensions that come up in dealing with individuals. But if you have a perfect liberal democratic society, you'll actually create a place in which people can treat each other properly, and that will be the sort of new world order type thing.
So I think you say that some historians view Ernest White's role in the founding of the modern Liberal Party as quite positive and essential, but you're a bit more sceptical about his role, aren't you?
Yeah, you could, if we're going to go with the sort of Christian metaphors, he's got a bit of a John the Baptist reputation as far as he's founding this Liberal Party at the beginning of 1943. He's identifying the same problems that Menzies ultimately identifies as far as, no, you do actually need to have explicit general principles, an explicit philosophy on which you found a party that gives it its raison d'etre and will inform all of its policy making going forward. But he doesn't come from a political background. He's better at identifying the problems than reaching any solutions to them. He's constantly thorn in the side of anyone who wants a sort of pragmatic or practical solution to anything. He resigns in a huff from the New South Wales Division's provisional executive because there's still some question marks over what role the IPA will have in that organisation. And by 1947, he's not even an ordinary member of the Liberal Party, and he's sort of throwing little snarky remarks to the Sydney Morning Herald during the election campaign that aren't helping the campaign. So he doesn't have that team player that you really need to be a successful political figure in the long term. But he's still really important in pressing forward these debates that ultimately lead to the founding of the Liberal Party.
So what would have his relationship been like with Robert Menzies, for example? Is there evidence that they got on well, that they were working hard together for this outcome?
Yeah, there's correspondence between them that survives in the Menzies papers. And I think basically distance helped the relationship. It was a lot easier to get on with Ernest White through some letters in the post than it was constantly at meetings in Sydney. And Ernest White also just had some terrible political judgment. One of his real blunders was that he initially supported the Powers referendum in 1944 because part of his FDR love affair was that even though he was a Liberal and supported certain Liberal principles, he wasn't that scared of centralisation. And being a New South Welshman from the biggest state, centralisation is not as scary to New South Wales people in general because Sydney's going to have the most votes anyway. And it's only late in the day where he figures out which way the wind is blowing and all the centre-right are opposing the Powers referendum that he comes to this argument that, I believe in centralisation, but the current Labor government can't be trusted with these additional powers, which is, are you envisioning additional powers in which there will never be another Labor government again?
Yeah. Does he ever get elected to Parliament?
No, he actually initially says that he's not seeking a seat, that he's just trying to be this sort of reformer. And again, speaking of that independent streak in the centre-right, there's all sorts of precedents. There's a People's Reform League that had this, in New South Wales, that had this bizarre system where it would pre-select candidates, but then you'd have to resign from the organisation because it didn't accept politicians in the organisation. So he's from that sort of strand.
Right.
Though in his ADB article, apparently he was finally permanently banned from the Liberal Party in 1954 for standing against an endorsed candidate.
Oh, right. So he did try.
Eventually,
he did try.
Yeah, he went back on that.
So who would you consider then with the founders of the modern New South Wales division of the Liberal Party?
Well, it turns out to be two outsiders that end up being the real key figures in the early Liberal Party in Bill Spooner and John Carrick. Bill Spooner's only sort of an outsider. His brother's a New South Wales parliamentarian who actually initiates a backbench revolt that brings down the Stevens government in 1939. But he himself is not a member of the Democratic Party. He's not a member of the LDP. He ends up the chairman of the provisional executive as a sort of compromise candidate that they can both agree on. But his real strength is that, again, he's a World War I veteran, but he's an accountant, and he's such a skilled accountant. He's run the accountancy for the Tooths Brewing Company in New South Wales. He takes over the legacy accountancy, and he's so good with money that he can make the shoestring budget of the early New South Wales Liberal Party work because they basically don't have enough money running off the smell of an oil rag. But they still have enough money to employ John Carrick, who is a survivor of Changi and the Thailand-Burma Railway, one of these amazing figures who at 27, he's a bit lost for what he wants to do after the war. He really wants to get into medicine, but that path is sort of closed to him. So he takes up a temporary job as a research officer with the New South Wales Division, ends up working with them until 1971 and only retiring so he can enter the Senate.
Yeah, he's an amazing figure of Australian politics, not just of Liberal politics. So John Carrick is appointed what we would now call state director, and Bill Spooner is sort of like the first state president. They are quite incredible in what they're able to do. I mean, John Carrick, his development of his own sort of political philosophy in that role is incredibly important to the success of the federal Liberal Party particularly, isn't it?
Yeah, so New South Wales is the problem you have to solve if the federal Liberal Party is going to work, because 4 seats is just not going to cut it when the largest proportion of seats is in New South Wales. So they have this mammoth task ahead of them. They go to all sorts of lengths in pre-selecting candidates and travelling all over New South Wales, getting local intel on who the local candidate should be. None of this parachuting in or having sort of secret lists and factional deals. It's very grassroots political movement in these early days. And that feeds into one of Carrick's great sayings, which is, you can't fatten a pig on market day, which is this idea that, no, you actually need to pre-select your candidate pretty much immediately after the previous election and be campaigning for the full 3 years if you really want to reap electoral dividends. His other great saying that he really emphasized was "Vive la différence," which is this idea that you should actually emphasize the liberal philosophy. You should emphasize the thinking behind your policies, why that is consistent and philosophically informed, and really give the electors a clear choice when it comes to election time.
And you see that, don't you, in a lot of the campaign materials and messaging of that time, that there is a lot of, this is the liberal, he calls it the liberal way of progress versus the socialist way. And they are quite different ways of progressing our nation, developing our nation, and giving individuals the opportunity to progress themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. He becomes such a sort of philosopher because when he first gets appointed to a position within the division in 46, he doesn't know what he really wants to do with his life. Yet within 2 years, he is the general secretary. He is that sort of director role, and he writes this book, The Liberal Way of Progress, in 1949. But that's really informed by his experiences as a POW. So he's in Timor, he gets captured by the Japanese, and he experiences all this sort of brutality. But after the war, he actually refuses to testify in war crimes trials against his captors because he actually argues that it's the system that created the evil rather than the individuals who were molded by that system. And that's why he's so keen on having an Australian system that's really going to uphold the individual and their freedom and their dignity rather than these totalitarian regimes who had really just saw the individual as a number, someone who was just part of the machine, and the state was the all-powerful overlord.
And that experience in World War II, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, I know with Andrew Kemp, these 49ers, this spirit of 49, and of course John Carrick as the General Secretary overseeing that campaign, they are imbued with this sense of, the future and post-war reconstruction, and we need to find a better way for Australia if we're going to be a nation of opportunity, of prosperity, of significance.
Yeah, so there's two facets to that. So there's the initial, during the war, let's come up with a philosophy, let's come up with a vision for the post-World War, which is where White comes in. And then there's the actual 49ers themselves, these people who actually, they've been too busy with the war to be part of those debates in 43, 44, but they bring to the issue this fresh perspective that is very much based around the fact that they've been fighting against totalitarianism. They have this sense of perspective that they've already risked their lives. So they don't have the same fears of, say, am I going to get a job? Am I going to be able to own a house? Even though home ownership's a very important issue for the early Liberal Party, they just have this self-confidence that modern politicians and modern generations, as a millennial, you can't even imagine what it would be like. And that all feeds into the 49er phenomenon. And the 49er phenomenon is a phenomenon that's at its greatest strength in New South Wales because the Liberal Party had held so few seats. And when you double the size of the House of Representatives, well, the state with the most House of Representatives seats gets the most of those doubled numbers.
And this is an amazing change in, circumstances and the zeitgeist of New South Wales. Is it the 47 state election? Menzies is told, as leader of the federal Liberal Party, told to stay away. He's not very popular. There's that you can't win with Menzies phenomenon. But by 49, when the Liberals finally do win their first federal election, and it's John Carrick's crowning achievement with that campaign, it's New South Wales that delivers it. Like often, it's said these days, Queensland delivers, the LNP victory at a federal level. New South Wales was able to do that in 49, and also with the Prime Minister at the time, Ben Chifley, from New South Wales himself. So it's a double whammy against the governing Labor Party in 49.
Yeah, well, obviously bank nationalisation helped, but that's not enough of an explanation on its own. I think that the keys to 49, we've talked about candidate pre-selection and really hitting the ground running from an early date. But I think that New South Wales really warmed to the more sort of philosophical Liberal Party, and one that really based its pitch in the aspirational suburbs, that forgotten people dream of home ownership. I think that really resonated in New South Wales, and it sort of gradually transformed their image of who Menzies was. Because I think people in New South Wales, when they first saw Menzies, just saw Stanley Melbourne Bruce 2.0. He was just another embodiment of the Melbourne establishment, and we don't want much to do with the Melbourne establishment. Obviously, Menzies' personal story is not like that, but that's not what you first get to know. And it took quite a while for New South Welshmen to warm to Menzies. But certainly after 49, it was the complete opposite of 47. They couldn't get enough of him, a bit like John Howard, even to this day. You always wanted to pull up Menzies to your campaign.
So who were some of the significant figures then who become part of the 49er phenomenon in New South Wales?
Well, I've already mentioned Harrison, who's obviously not a 49er, but really lays this platform because he is all the New South Wales Liberal Party is. And I think it's almost quite insulting to New South Wales that when he retires to become High Commissioner, they replace his deputy leader position with a Victorian. That there's a Victorian number 1 and a Victorian number 2. They never would have gotten away with that.
It keeps repeating itself, I think, that phenomenon, Zach.
They never would have gotten away with that in the 40s. And I think it's a self-confidence that Menzies has after the split. But as far as the 49ers, there's all sorts of ministers. I think it's 4 or 5 different ministers that all get elected in one go in 49. They go from 5 seats in 1946. So they've only picked up 1 at the 46 election. It's not the biggest, most positive early showing for the Liberal Party or for Menzies, which is why in 47 they still don't trust him. But then they pick up 16 seats in 1949. So it goes from 5 to 21 New South Wales UAP representatives. The most memorable, of course, is Billy McMahon, who, for all his problems, and I have got a Quadrant article called Redeeming McMahon, like trying to make the case that he did have some redeeming qualities, he would finally break through and be the first New South Wales Liberal Prime Minister since Joseph Cook. And Joseph Cook is so far back that he was actually using Banjo Patterson's campaign song. He had adapted the lyrics so it no longer talked about Carruthers, but seeing as they're both Joseph C's, it was pretty...
But at the state level, the New South Wales Liberal Party didn't do so well. There was sort of a sense that the New South Wales campaign architecture and division was more focused on federal success than state success.
Yeah, so the Liberal headquarters was known as Ash Street in the CBD, and it was something that they inherited. It was a building that the UAP had bought, so they owned the full premises. And they shared Ash Street with the Federal Secretariat for the first few years. So quite naturally, there was a lot of focus on federal matters. Even Bill Spooner, while being president of the New South Wales division, was actually the treasurer of the Federal Party. So there was this focus on federal matters. And it really became a sort of snowballing effect. That what happened was in 47, they make some good gains, the 47 state election, despite Menzies still being unpopular and despite not having the momentum from the bank nationalisation issue. Then in 1950, they fall agonisingly short. This is just after the 49 election, all the momentum's towards the Liberals. They achieve a hung parliament, but they just aren't able to get across the line. And then basically from then on, the timing just becomes awful. So the next election is while Menzies is still recovering from the horror budget, Menzies is incredibly unpopular. Then they become so entrenched in government, the Labor Party at a certain point, that nobody wants to run as a Liberal candidate at the state level that's of any talent. And even those who do sort of treat it as a part-time job. So it just becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that the Liberal Party in New South Wales is a natural party of opposition rather than a natural party of government.
And you spoke about it earlier, this sort of failure to promote women, whereas say in states like Victoria and Tasmania, that was happening, meant that there was missed opportunity there in terms of attracting the female vote. But there was also an issue around the Catholic vote, which, as you said earlier, had been very much captured by the Conservative side of the Labor Party, where there were quite a few prominent Catholic MPs. And this meant that the Liberal Party was sort of seen as the Protestant North Sydney party. Is that right?
Yeah, the Liberal Party in New South Wales was known for being especially Protestant. That's the phrase that's used. So even though basically all Liberal parties across Australia are known to be sort of full of Freemasons and have all sorts of shady deals that makes it hard for Catholics to get promoted, the worst example is New South Wales. And you really see the massive vote drop-off once you no longer have Lyons as the face of the UAP, that traditional Catholic suspicion of centre-right politics really plays out. But the problem is not just that the Catholics won't vote for the Liberal Party, it's that the Liberal Party itself becomes such a sort of closed shop that's not open to new ideas, not open to migrants. But Carrick, to his credit, is constantly pushing against this. Carrick's one of 6 children born to a simple clerk who loses his job during the Great Depression. So he's not part of this Mosman or Vaucluse aristocracy. And he is the one that really catches on to the state aid issue as this way that you can cut through the Gordian knot, that you can end all the sectarian prejudices underlying New South Wales politics and be able to attract not just Catholic voters, but this far broader swathe of aspirational voters that want freedom of choice. That's the other thing about it. It's not some Machiavellian idea to be able to woo Catholic voters. It also is vive la différence. This is what Liberals believe in, is school choice. And he actually is subject to a vicious backlash from the Vaucluse and Mosman aristocracy. There's all these circular letters that get sent anonymously to New South Wales branches attacking the Ash Street Kingmaker for his obsession over state aid.
So it wasn't until 1965 that the New South Wales Liberals won the state election, and they were led by Robert Askin. Tell me, what was it about him that worked for the Liberals, do you think?
So he was really trying, if William McKell is the anti-Lang, Bob Askin is the anti all that came before him in the New South Wales Liberal Party. He owns this printing business in Manly, but as soon as he becomes opposition leader, he sells it to be like, no, I'm a full-time professional politician. This is what I'm going to do.
And that was unusual for that era to just devote yourself to politics.
There was no shadow cabinet until 1977 in New South Wales consistently. It's a long tradition in centre-right politics that centre-right politics sort of trends to promote people into parliament who've already succeeded elsewhere in their life and have a lot more going on, whereas Labor, you're more just a representative of the trade union movement. It's not even your seat, it's the union movement's seat. So he does that. He's also got this greater appeal to working class voters. He has more of a working class background. He actually spends evenings sleeping overnight in Wentworth Park in Glebe when he can't afford to keep a roof over his health. He plays reserve grade rugby league for the Glebe Dirty Reds. So he's just got this working class sort of mystique that he can project to the electorate. And he's also got really great PR in projecting that mystique to the electorate, because he has Donald Horne writing all his campaign slogans, and everything's with Askin, you'll get action.
Yeah, it's great. Well, this is before Donald Horne turned against his early conservative philosophical outlook. The New South Wales division to this day grapples with so many of the same problems that it did in its early years and even its precursor to the new evolution of the Liberal Party in 44. It's interesting too that the New South Wales Labor Party tends to be more conservative than the different divisions of the Labor Party around the country. I mean, this is sort of, I guess, why the work we do is so important, because you can understand political trends today from looking at the history and see how they evolve.
Yeah, certainly. I think the Nationals aren't as bad as they once were. They're doing a bit better in controlling the country seats, but now the country seats aren't as prominent. So it's far more the onus is on the Liberals that they have to win those outer suburban seats. They have to win those inspirational seats. And that's what they did in 2011, where they captured so much of Western Sydney, and that laid the platform for 12 years of Liberal governments, which is a record Liberal government for New South Wales. That Askin won 4 elections, but he's still only in power for 10 years because it wasn't the set 4-year terms back then. But what really eats away at the New South Wales Liberal Party is not just a return to form and still having all the institutional power be in those Manly and eastern suburbs seats, and therefore a lot of concern for what the Teal voters thinks and how that doesn't necessarily correlate with what people in Western Sydney think. But Askin retires from politics and there's these massive corruption scandals, and it really psychologically haunts the New South Wales Liberal Party. The next time they get in, they set up ICAC to completely disassociate themselves with that legacy. But ICAC is given these extraordinary powers that go against all the sort of normal safeguards of law enforcement and the rule of law. And it's really come back to haunt the New South Wales Liberal Party ever since.
Well, indeed. Poor Barry O'Farrell and that bottle of Grange. Hey? Zach, you obviously bring a wealth of knowledge to the history of Liberalism, but particularly the New South Wales Liberal Party, and it's great to have you on Afternoon Light for a third time.
Yeah, it's been great.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.